Let me first just say, thanks to the Solana and Anza teams for having me. This is actually my first time speaking at a Solana event. Very excited to be here. Today, I'd like to talk about slashing. First off, though, I am head of research at A16Z. Needless to say, nothing in this presentation should be construed as financial or investment advice. So this is a talk about blockchain consensus. So if you're at Roger Wattenhover's talk yesterday, very much exactly the same thing. This is the picture I want you to have in your head, right? So what's the point fundamentally of the consensus layer of a blockchain protocol? You take a whole bunch of physical machines, like say 1,500 Solana validators, that's the cloud here, and you make them act logically like a single virtual machine. Okay, so all the validators are hearing about different transactions submitted by different clients. They hear about them in a different order. Despite all of that heterogeneity, the point of the consensus layer is to make sure they all agree on a single sequence of transactions. Those are the transactions that get processed then in the, for example, the Solana virtual machine. Okay? So that's the consensus layer of a blockchain protocol. And Roger yesterday really focused on sort of performance issues. I'm actually just going to focus on the most basic kind of correctness notion. So what does it mean for a consensus protocol to be correct? It has two parts, consistency and liveness. Even if you've never studied this stuff, you have some awareness of what these properties are, or at least of what it means when these properties fail. Okay? So even if you just follow the news and look at ways that blockchain protocols tend to sort of break down, there's sort of two main categories. Sometimes you hear about like a chain reorganization. So this would usually be with the longest chain protocol. Like there were some very big chain reorgs in Ethereum Classic a couple years ago. That's the canonical consistency violation. Okay, so you thought a bunch of transactions had been finalized, but there was a big reorganization of the chain. Sorry, just kidding, a bunch of transactions get rolled back. Okay, so that's a consistency violation. Sometimes you hear a blockchain protocol stalling. Okay, just fails to process any transactions for minutes or hours. That's the canonical example of a violation of liveness. Okay, so we want both of those things to never happen. We want to aspire to consensus protocols that are always consistent and always live. That's not such an easy problem. And the reason is because the real world gets in the way and unexpected things can happen. Like the machines running your blockchain protocol, they might do the wrong thing. Maybe just by accident, maybe they just crash or something like that. Or maybe actually it's controlled by a bad actor who really wants to mess up your protocol. Okay? Or maybe the communication network is also less reliable than you thought. Maybe the delays in message delivery were longer than what you were hoping for when you designed your consensus protocol. So both of these challenges interfere with potentially having consistency and liveness. And there are even fundamental impossibility results. Roger briefly alluded to this yesterday. And the exact magic threshold depends on the setting, but in a common setting, it's the case that if 33% of the stake of a proof-of-stake protocol, like Solana, for example, is controlled by Byzantine validators, then in fact, that adversary is strong enough to trigger a consistency violation or a liveness violation, whichever it chooses. Okay? So what this talk is about and what slashing is about is that if you find yourself in this unfortunate situation where the adversary is strong enough that they can actually break correctness of your consensus protocol, is there anything you can do? Is there any way you can fight back and somehow recover the good case where you actually have guaranteed consistency and liveness? Okay? All right. And so slashing, proof of stake, simple resistance, as used in Solana and many other blockchain protocols, has a lot of great advantages. Slashing was not the first one that people thought of, but it has emerged as a very important one. And this is the idea that if there's a consistency violation or a liveness violation, if something goes wrong, there's a two-step process you'd like to do. First of all, you figure out whose fault it is. Okay, so you identify some validators that deviated from the protocol. And then secondly, you hold them responsible and you punish them economically by slashing their stake. Okay? So for example, just zeroing out their stake balances. And notice there's no analog of this idea of slashing, this targeted punishment, in a proof-of-work protocol like Bitcoin. Right? Bitcoin, it's just software. It can't magically reach out some arm and confiscate ASICs away from bad actors. But the magic of a proof-of-stake protocol is, the sort of economically valuable resource that the validators have is literally tracked by the blockchain's state. So the blockchain protocol certainly is, in principle, capable of confiscating in this targeted way validators identified as guilty parties to one of these correctness violations. Okay? So there's a couple ways you can actually carry out slashing if you decide you want to do it. And in Solana, my understanding is, to date, there has not been a slashing event in Solana. But if there was one, the way it would happen would be basically manually. Right? So periodically, All of the Solana validators sort of update the current version of the protocol. There's a hard fork. As part of one of those hard forks, you can make modifications to the Solana state. For example, you could zero out the balance of validators you'd identified as guilty parties in some previous attack. So that's sometimes also known as social slashing. And my understanding is that's kind of the preference of the Solana community. Ethereum actually has a very different approach. They've always really wanted slashing to be sort of in protocol, to be programmatic, so that if you can actually kind of prove that some validator deviated and post evidence on-chain in Ethereum, that will automatically trigger the slashing of a validator's stake without any human in the loop, for better or for worse, okay? So I think both of these are totally reasonable. Actually, honestly, as a researcher and an educator, it's very, in my opinion, it's very cool that the two biggest proof-of-stake protocols are pursuing these two different approaches. And time will tell sort of if one of these emerges as the best way to do it. Okay, but I think my viewpoint is that they're both reasonable approaches to how to carry out slashing. Okay. All right. So I mentioned that the idea of slashing, it's really this two-part process. First of all, figure out who's responsible for a correctness violation, and then secondly, carry out the slashing. So this first step actually has its own word in the consensus literature, and that word is accountability. So when one talks about a consensus protocol being accountable, what it means is that following a violation, either consistency or liveness, you are guaranteed to be able to identify a large set of perpetrators, while also never falsely accusing an honest validator. That is what it means for a consensus protocol to be accountable. Some protocols are accountable, some are not. But this is what it means if it is, in fact, accountable. This is a prerequisite to slashing. To slash, you need to know who to slash. Accountability is the property that you do, in fact, know who you'd like to slash. Okay? I know that may sound a little abstract, but let me just give you kind of like the absolutely canonical example, very practical example too, which is whenever you have a consensus protocol that's based on voting and based on quorums. So today's Solana consensus is to some extent like this. The Alpenglow upgrade would be very much like this. So whenever you have a consensus protocol where validators are supposed to be voting for things, a smoking gun that you have deviated from the protocol is if you've signed two different votes for incompatible blocks. If you're running correct code, you will never, ever do that. So if you provide me with evidence, if you show me, right, the votes are signed. So if you say, look, this validator signed both of these votes, the blocks conflict, I can conclude irrefutably that that validator did in fact deviate from the protocol. Moreover, if you have a well-designed consensus protocol, and Alpenglow would certainly be in this category, it's actually the only way you can create a consistency violation is by doing a ton of this double voting. Okay, so necessarily a consistency violation, you need 33% of the stake at minimum to have these smoking guns, okay, to have these double votes for incompatible blocks. Okay, so that's a really nice property. All right? Liveness is going to be trickier, as we'll see. Okay? So in the rest of the talk, I just want to give you a quick TLDR to two different papers of mine over the past year or so. The first one focused on provable slashing guarantees following a consistency violation. The second paper is about the first theory of accountable liveness. And these are going to be very brief, obviously. If you want to know more in-depth discussion, both of these papers have long videos, hour-plus long videos on my YouTube channel, if you want to know all the gory details. All right, so the first paper, again, this is about slashing following a consistency violation. So again, you want to think about like two conflicting blocks somehow get finalized. That's the kind of violation we're worried about in this paper. Joint work with Eric Budish from Chicago, Andy Lewis-Pye from London School of Economics. So we introduced this notion of what we call an EAC protocol. EAC here is an acronym for, you don't have to remember it, but if you're curious, expensive to attack even in the absence of collapse, meaning collapse of the token price. But really what it means is that following a consistency violation, the bad guys should lose stake and the honest guys should not. And that should always be true. You want to guarantee that that will in fact happen. Every consistency violation inevitably leads to bad guys losing stake, honest guys never lose stake. That's an EAC protocol. And so the point of this paper is to understand when and how you can achieve this EAC property, which is really the promise of slashing. Okay? Okay. So the paper has three main results. So let me just sort of quickly step through them. There's going to be two results which establish limitations on when you can have provable slashing guarantees, followed by a sort of positive result which says those are the only limitations. Okay? So limitation number one says you cannot use a longest chain protocol. if you want provable slashing guarantees. Now, when I say longest chain, you probably think about like Bitcoin, but don't think about Bitcoin, because Bitcoin's proof of work, Sybil resistance. As we discussed, there the valuable resource is off-chain, so what hope do you have of confiscating it from anybody? But there's also proof of stake, longest chain protocols. There's a few in production. And so this theory says that you literally cannot have provable slashing guarantees in a proof of stake longest chain protocol. As soon as an attacker is large enough that they can actually cause a consistency violation, they are also large enough that they can get away with it, and there's no way you can punish them for it. So if you want slashing guarantees, you need to use the right kind of protocol, a protocol based on votes and quorums. Again, to some extent, like today's Solana consensus, very much Alpenglow's consensus is exactly the kind of protocol you should use. Furthermore, for provable slashing guarantees, it is important that the cooldown period is sufficiently long. Cooldown period, what do I mean? As a validator, you're staked. At some point you say, I don't want to be a validator anymore. I want to unstake and get my assets back. The cooldown period is the length of time between when you initiate the unstaking transaction and when you actually get your assets back. Okay, that's the cooldown period. That needs to be sufficiently long. What does sufficiently long mean? It needs to be longer than what it takes for honest validators to communicate and coordinate even when the world is going haywire. Okay, so even when there's lots of bad guys controlling validators, even when there's denial of service attacks on the network, maybe they have to resort to a Discord server or phone calls or whatever, but it's the amount of time that they need the honest validators to coordinate and exchange information. So that's how long the cooldown period has to be. So maybe ballpark days would be my recommendation. Okay? If you don't do that, what happens is that basically Byzantine validators can first of all cause a consistency violation, but then in fact withdraw their assets before anyone even notices the consistency violation. And at that point, there is no hope of slashing them. Okay? So those are two fundamental limitations of provable slashing guarantees. You need to use the right kind of protocol, one based on voting and one based on quorums. You need to have sufficiently long cooldown period, but the good news is if you do those two things, use the right kind of protocol, long cooldown periods, you do in fact get provable slashing guarantees. And here I'm talking about even the programmatic type. So even in protocol, you can guarantee that the attacker will lose a large amount of stake, while also guaranteeing that honest validators will never lose stake. You do have to assume the attacker isn't so big that they can just literally take over the blockchain protocol. So you're assuming that the attacker has less than 67% of the stake, but that's much, much more than 33% of the stake, of course. All right? So that's the TLDR of the first paper. So if you want to slash following a consistency violation, got to use the right kind of protocol. And again, Alpenglow is a great example. You got to have long cooldown periods, and then you're good. So this next paper just came out a few weeks ago. It's again with Andy Lewis Pai, but now also my colleague at A16Z Crypto, Joachim Noy, and Lucas Zanolini from the Ethereum Foundation. And so again, I talked about slashing in this two-step process. So first of all, identify the perpetrators. Second of all, carry out the slashing. So the first paper focused on the second step because there was already a nice theory of the first step. For liveness violations before this work, there wasn't even a nice theory of the first step. Like if a blockchain stalls, whose fault is it? So that's the point of the second paper, is to try to answer that question. If a blockchain protocol stalls, whose fault is it? Okay? All right. And so one of the maybe high-order bits to take away from this talk is that slashing for liveness is a lot more challenging than slashing for consistency violations. Okay? Even just accountability for liveness is a lot trickier than accountability for consistency. And in hindsight, there's a few reasons why you're like, okay, well, now that I think about it, maybe I would have expected that. Let me just give you sort of maybe one of the more obvious reasons now, which is that if the blockchain stalls, right, if it stops processing transactions, it might be the fault of some validators that are deliberately not participating to prevent progress, or it might be the fault of the network, right? It might be the fault of the communication network. And notice, this is not something that goes wrong with consistency violations, right? How do you know there was a consistency violation? Like you've got these sort of signed votes by validators, this smoking gun that they deviated from the protocol, okay? Communication networks cannot frame validators by forging signatures on their behalf. Or I guess if your communication network can forge signatures, I want to meet your communication network, okay? So that's not going to happen. With liveness, though, stalls, that happens because of the absence of messages that you were expecting, the absence of votes, the absence of sort of sending messages that you received a quorum. And that certainly could be the fault of the communication network as opposed to Byzantine validators. So that ambiguity is fundamental. Right? So we do have a theory of accountable liveness, but we are going to need some additional compromises. Okay? So in this paper, we give the first definition. Definition, I think, is not that surprising if you've studied accountable safety, but you do have to get it right. So the first assumption, which you do not need for consistency violations, is you need to assume an honest majority. To have any hope of accountable liveness, you need to assume that 51% of the stake is controlled by honest validators. Okay? Otherwise, you have no hope. The reason being that if half of the stake is Byzantine, they're actually powerful enough to frame the honest validators. They're powerful enough to cause a stall and yet basically frame the honest validators for the liveness violation that they themselves caused. No analog for consistency violations. Again, Byzantine validators cannot forge signatures of honest validators. They cannot frame them for consistency violations. They can for liveness violations. That's a fundamental difference. Secondly, okay, even if you do have honest majority, you need to make some kind of additional timing assumptions, some kind of assumptions on the reliability of message delivery. Okay, you do not have to do this for consistency violations. Provably, you do have to do this if you want accountability for liveness violations. Basically because of the ambiguity between a faulty network and faulty validators that we discussed earlier. So now the same pattern recurs, right? I gave you two limitations, two obstacles to what we want, accountable liveness. And the good news is those are the only two obstacles. Okay? In the sense that if you do have an honest majority, 51% of the stake controlled by honest validators, and if you make some assumptions about the reliability of message delivery, namely that the network is more often synchronous than it is asynchronous, so more than half the time messages are delivered promptly. If you're willing to make those two assumptions, then in fact you can have provable, accountable liveness. And we show how to modify any number of standard consensus protocols. We use tendermint in our paper. My guess is you could do it for alpenglow, but I'd have to check the details. So we show how you can graft on additional logic to a protocol like tendermint so that you do in fact achieve this property, again, assuming an honest majority of stake and assuming that you have a majority synchronous communication network. Okay? So with my last slide, let me just wrap up with a couple implications for Solana. I'll make one comment about consistency violations, one about liveness violations. So for consistency violations, so again, things like double spends, things like sort of two conflicting blocks getting finalized, for those kinds of failures, Solana is going to be in great shape to have the full menu of options available. Okay? So alpenglow, if desired, is exactly the kind of protocol where you get the best possible accountability guarantees, where you only have consistency violations. If there's tons of double voting, you can catch all of the people who are double voting under the assumptions I mentioned for the first paper. And once you catch all the people double voting, then you can do whatever you want. If you want to have programmatic slashing, that's an option. If you don't like programmatic slashing, if you want to rely on social slashing, fine, also an option. Okay, but you have all the options on the table for dealing with consistency violations. I think you to some extent have that in today's Solana consensus, but you especially have it with the alpenglow framework. Now, liveness, as we just saw, is trickier, right? You don't get this smoking gun quite as much. What you get is you get a pile of evidence that basically says either this batch of validators deviated from the protocol and deliberately tried to stall the protocol, or the communication network was way more messed up than we thought it was going to be. And as we saw, provably, you cannot have unambiguous evidence about which of those two is the case. So my interpretation of that is that it's maybe a little aggressive to do programmatic or in-protocol slashing for liveness violations, because there's always this plausible deniability of having an unreliable communication network. So to me, our theory of accountable liveness is actually a perfect fit for social slashing, right? Because our theory gives you this pile of evidence, which could then be reviewed out of protocol by a committee of experts, and they could decide, was it the validators, was it the network, using whatever other information they can find. If they find it's the validators, then again, you can choose to slash them, for example, through social slashing, okay? So in summary, super exciting times for blockchain consensus, very exciting times for Solana consensus in particular. Right, Roger talked about all of the performance breakthroughs that have happened yesterday. I gave you a sort of survey of the advances we've gotten how to do slashing. Moreover, those two different types of advances are super compatible with each other. So personally, I'm very excited to see how all this plays out over the next year or so. Thanks very much.